When the unconscious becomes conscious, the first thing you feel is not clarity, it's pain. You begin to notice it the moment awareness dawns, a subtle discomfort that crawls under the skin, a sense that something inside you is breaking open. Most people confuse this for failure, depression, or punishment. But in truth, it is birth. The psyche does not expand with applause, it expands with fracture. When a truth long buried in the unconscious rises to the surface, it collides with everything you once used to survive your habits, your beliefs, your self-image, and friction always hurts. Carl Jung once said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." What he meant wasn't poetic, it was biological, psychic, spiritual. The unconscious isn't a library of forgotten memories. It's a living ecosystem of instincts, wounds, and ancestral codes. When you drag light into that soil, the roots protest. They have grown comfortable in the dark. Every piece of awareness you gain is a small act of violence against the old order within you. You thought awakening would feel like freedom, but the beginning always feels like loss, loss of illusion, loss of certainty, loss of the person you pretended to be. That is why the first stage of awakening often looks like collapse. The mind begins to see its own machinery. You start noticing how you speak to avoid truth, how you love to avoid loneliness, how you work to avoid silence. It's brutal. Awareness turns every distraction into a mirror. And suddenly you realize the pain was always there. You're only now sober enough to feel it. Consciousness doesn't invent suffering, it reveals it. The wound existed long before the light touched it. Most people stop here. They interpret the ache as a sign to turn back. They go back to sleep, back to noise, back to the comforting blindness of routine. Because consciousness strips away anesthesia. You can no longer lie to yourself convincingly. You can't pretend your relationships are healthy, that your ambitions are authentic, that your anger is righteous. Everything begins to wobble like a stage set, being dismantled after the play. And beneath it, you find the real architecture, the raw, unpolished truth of who you are when no one is watching. But if you stay, if you breathe through the chaos, instead of running from it, the pain begins to change texture. It becomes luminous, almost instructional. You begin to sense that this darkness is not an enemy, but a teacher. Each discomfort carries a message. This part of you wants to be integrated. Jung called it the process of individuation, the lifelong movement toward wholeness. To individuate is to invite the unconscious to the table, to let your shadows speak, to stop waging war against the parts of yourself you were taught to fear. That's why the early stages feel like destruction. You are losing your former self. The ego panics because its identity depends on repression, keeping the unconscious at bay. But consciousness is the great dissolver. It burns away false foundations not to punish, but to prepare. To see clearly is to be changed, and transformation by its nature hurts. Yet beneath that pain lies the quiet hum of something holy, life rearranging itself toward truth. Stay in that fire a little longer. The first heat is searing, but it's also sacred. What feels like breakdown is the psyche's way of clearing space for a fuller self to emerge. The light that burns you now will one day become the warmth that guides you. The first wave of awareness never arrives gently. It enters like light through a crack in the dam, flooding uninvited, unstoppable. Suddenly, the language you use to make sense of yourself begins to lose coherence. You look at your life and everything seems slightly out of focus. The career that once defined you feels hollow. The relationship that once soothed you now exposes your insecurities. What was once normal begins to feel foreign. That unease is not madness, it's the first symptom of seeing clearly. Jung understood this rupture as the psyche's way of restoring balance. When you repress too much anger, desire, grief, creativity, your unconscious becomes overloaded. It begins to leak. Symptoms, projections, patterns of self-sabotage. These are not random. They are coded messages from the depths demanding recognition. The moment you start listening instead of silencing, the unconscious responds by revealing its contents, and the revelation is rarely pleasant. What you meet first is not wisdom, but debris, the things you exiled in order to appear functional. Think of your mind as a house with locked rooms. For years, you've lived in the brightly lit living space, polishing the furniture, smiling at guests. The rest of the house, attic, basement, forgotten corridors, was kept sealed. When awareness expands, the doors start opening on their own. You smell the dust, the rot, the old grief still lingering in the air. You see versions of yourself you swore never to become. And yet, as Jung wrote, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. It's not the fantasy of light that liberates. It's the courage to touch the dark and name it without flinching. That's why pain is not a punishment in this process. It's proof that something real is occurring. The ego is dissolving its armor. The defense mechanisms, denial, projection, perfectionism, begin to lose their grip, and the raw material of the soul surfaces. You start feeling emotions that have no label, a sorrow that is both ancient and personal, a rage that doesn't belong to one event, but to centuries of silence. The unconscious is collective. When you awaken, you also awaken the pain of the species. That's why awareness often feels too big for the body. And yet, something in you knows you cannot unsee what you've seen. To go back would mean betraying your own evolution. You can sense the intelligence hidden inside the disorientation. This suffering has pattern and precision. It is sculpting you. It is forcing you to release control, to surrender to a process older than thought itself. The psyche wants wholeness, not comfort. Consciousness is its instrument of correction. If you look closely, you'll notice that alongside the pain, there's also a strange calm, a steady current beneath the turmoil. That is the self, the deeper center Jung spoke of, observing the chaos without being destroyed by it. You are not just the fragments being burned. You are also the flame that transforms them. Awareness hurts because it touches what resists change, but it also heals because it reminds you that you are larger than your wounds. So when the ache returns, when your chest tightens, when your old defenses collapse, don't rush to fix it. Witness it. Let it speak. Each tremor is a signal, another piece of your unconscious, ready to rejoin the whole. You are not falling apart. You are falling inward into a truth vast enough to hold everything you once feared to feel. At some point, the pain that once felt unbearable begins to reveal its architecture. You start to see that every breakdown has rhythm. Every despair has a pulse. It is the psyche's way of recalibrating itself, destroying old structures so that a new order can emerge. But make no mistake, this process has nothing romantic about it. Awakening is not a glow, it is demolition. You wake in the middle of the night with the sense that everything you knew has become untrustworthy. The words you use to rely on success, love, happiness begin to feel strangely hollow, like shells left behind by a vanished creature. What is dissolving is not your life, but your identification with its illusions. Jung called this the confrontation with the shadow, a meeting with everything the conscious ego rejects. The shadow is not evil, it's simply everything unlived. The parts of you you judged, buried, or moralized against begin to knock at the door, and they never knock politely. They come through projection, jealousy, sudden anger, envy, obsessive comparison, shame. Each reaction points toward an unintegrated fragment within. When you despise someone's arrogance, you're likely suppressing your own healthy confidence. When you worship someone's freedom, you're often avoiding your own confinement. Every person you meet becomes a mirror, not of who they are, but of who you have not yet allowed yourself to be. At first, this is exhausting. The mind wants to go back to the comfort of certainty, to label things good or bad, friend or foe. But awareness dismantles those binaries. You start to realize that your shadow contains your vitality. Beneath your rage is passion. Beneath envy is the desire to expand. Beneath shame is tenderness. Integration means reclaiming those energies, not repressing them. That's why Jung warned one does not become whole by suppressing, but by integrating. You cannot ascend by denying the earthiness of your own instincts. As you move through this stage, solitude becomes both your crucible and your sanctuary. People who once mirrored your unawareness may no longer feel aligned. You begin to prefer silence over small talk, depth over distraction. The world calls it withdrawal. The psyche calls it incubation. Something within you is reassembling. In the stillness, the fragments start to speak a common language. You begin to sense an inner coherence forming a new axis around which your life will soon revolve. But before that harmony settles, there is often a long season of disorientation. Jung called it enantiodromia, the law of reversal, the moment when everything flips into its opposite. The extrovert becomes contemplative, the confident feels doubt, the skeptic encounters faith. It is the psyche correcting its imbalance. You cannot see the full spectrum of light until you've made peace with shadow. In this reversal, suffering becomes alchemical. The very emotions that once enslaved you begin to serve you. Anger sharpens discernment. Fear deepens humility. Loneliness expands empathy. You realize that consciousness doesn't eliminate darkness. It teaches you to navigate it with grace. Pain becomes a form of information, a precise message about what in you still resists love. And slowly, you begin to understand why the first touch of awareness burned so much, because it was sacred. The psyche was trying to make room for something greater, the self, that silent, watchful intelligence beneath personality. Every tear, every loss, every confusion tone was the sound of walls being lowered so that the inner cathedral could be built. You are not becoming better. You are becoming real. To become conscious is to risk everything false. The cost is high comfort, belonging, identity, but the reward is wholeness. And once you have tasted even a drop of that reality, you cannot go back to sleep. You would rather live in raw truth than in perfect illusion. That is how awareness matures from a wound into a doorway. And then comes the quiet after the storm, the strange stillness that follows the burning away of illusion. You wake one morning and realize the pain has not vanished, but it has changed its texture. It no longer feels like punishment. It feels like presence. You are finally inhabiting your own life, not the performance of it. What once tore you apart now moves through you, like weather intense but impermanent. This is where understanding becomes embodied. Awareness is no longer a theory, it's how you breathe. You begin to see that consciousness isn't about escaping the unconscious, but collaborating with it. Every instinct, dream, and emotion is now a messenger rather than an intruder. You start to listen instead of control. You realize that to be awake is not to hover above life, but to participate in it completely, to let joy and grief pass through the same open door without labeling either as mistake. Jung called this the union of opposites, the moment when you stop dividing yourself into light and dark, holy and human, and instead recognize that both belong to the same sacred field. What you once condemned in yourself becomes the very ground of compassion. You understand that healing was never about fixing what was broken, but remembering what was forgotten. The self, the vast center beyond ego, had always been here quietly, orchestrating the whole journey, letting you wander until you were ready to return. You no longer need to chase transcendence. You see the divine in the ordinary, the way light hits a cup, the sound of your own breath, the patience of the trees. Awareness is not an achievement, it's a homecoming. The unconscious and the conscious are no longer enemies. They are lovers, reunited after a long separation. And like all true reunions, it happens not with fireworks, but with a deep exhale, a release so simple it almost feels like nothing. The ego, now humbled, learns its rightful place, servant, not ruler. It still fears, still doubts, still clings, but you no longer identify with it entirely. You watch its movements like weather patterns, knowing that behind every storm is the unchanging sky of awareness itself. You are that sky. The thoughts, emotions, and stories that once possessed you are now clouds passing through your field of being, and so the circle closes. The unconscious became conscious. The pain became understanding. The fragment became whole. You see now that every wound was a seed, every collapse a clearing. Consciousness was never about ascending to light, but allowing light to enter the deepest dark without fear. To see yourself fully, to meet your shadow, to love your limits, to accept the mess and the miracle together, that is the true awakening. In the end, you understand what Jung meant when he said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Awareness doesn't change the world outside you. It changes the one inside, and from that center, the outer world rearranges itself naturally. The pain that once seemed senseless becomes sacred, because it delivered you here to this moment. This clarity, this calm recognition, consciousness is not the destination. It is the way home.